The Prosecutors. The first warrants for arrest for witchcraft at Salem were issued on February 29, 1692, on complaint preferred by Joseph Hutchinson, Thomas Putnam, Edward Putnam, and Thomas Preston, that Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba had by witchcraft, within the last 2 months, done harm to Elizabeth Parris, Abigail Williams, and Putnam, and Elizabeth Hubbard. Complaint of Martha Corey was made by Edward Putnam and Henry Kenny, March 19. Edward Putnam and Jonathan Putnam complained of Rebecca Nurse, and Jonathan Walcott and Nathaniel Ingersoll, against Elizabeth Proctor. Perusal of the record shows that very many of the most intelligent, influential, highly respected, and trusted men of the village were complainants. And shows also that, as early as February 29, when the first complaint was entered, there were 4 afflicted ones, 2 in the family of Mr. Parris, 1 in that of Thomas Putnam, living more than 2 miles north from the parsonage, and 1 in that of Dr. Griggs, dwelling more than 2 miles east from the same. Thus much had the trouble spread before the law was invoked to aid in its suppression. The homes of the minister, the doctor, and the parish clerk, a capable and good one, too, were the first invaded. Not mean abodes housed, nor low-lived people cared for the first afflicted ones. Men of the highest standing there were leaders off in the impending conflict with the devil. 2 were most prominently and persistently active, viz., Thomas Putnam and Mr. Parris. And why? If any people then and there knew what the emergency required, these 2 would be among them. None were more competent than they to perceive and perform the duties of such an hour. They, too, and theirs were the chief sufferers. No other active men there had motives pressing as theirs to work for prompt relief in their households, and we will notice these 2 as representatives of the prosecutors. Thomas Putnam deservedly held high position among the inhabitants there, and possessed the esteem, respect, and confidence of the whole community around him. How came it that this very intelligent, influential, and useful citizen, then a little more than 40 years old and in the full vigor of manhood, was prominent among the foremost and most pertinacious prosecutors? Why was such a one an enterer of complaints against neighbors, whether high or low, good or bad? Our response is, that in his home a loved and loving wife, cultured, refined, and of acute sensibilities, a daughter, 12 years old, bright and charming, and also Mercy Lewis, a young domestic, were all so mysteriously tortured at times. That no doubt existed in a mind which comprehended the creed of that day, that the devil was author of the abnormal torments. That enemy must be getting access to these innocent and loved ones, the creed said, through some neighbors, at least some living mortals, who had made covenants with the evil one, and thus become his agents. Imbued and bound by the creed of his day, this husband and father could cherish no expectation that his wife and child could be shielded, or that comfort, tranquility, and peace could come to him and his dear ones, so long as such covenanters were allowed to live. His creed, the general creed of the times, called upon him to invoke the law's aid, since by help from no other source could he hope to reclaim wife, child, and domestic from the clutches of hell's sovereign, and save his own fireside from continuing on indefinitely a frenzied pandemonium. The higher his manhood, and the deeper his love for wife and children, the more vigilant, resolute, and untiring would be his purpose and his efforts to use any and every available means for delivering his family from the hell which had been thrust in under his roof. The sufferings of his dear ones, then necessarily operative upon his mind and affections, we presume were the chief prompters of his course and incentives to his perseverance in it. Defense and protection of wife, children, and all within his household are incumbent on any one worthy to be called a man. Think not the worse of Thomas Putnam because of his resolute purposes and speedy as well as prolonged efforts to rescue from sufferings and perdition wife, child, and domestic. Because a prominent sufferer, he became a prominent prosecutor, yes, the most prominent. Though that fact stands boldly out on the pages of history, no one in his time or since, so far as we have noticed, ever imputed to him an unworthy motive, or annexed a disparaging epithet to his name. Perhaps he, as well as Mr. Dane of Andover, was tenderly touched because of a fair character. In part the same can be said in defense of Reverend Samuel Parris as we have adduced in defense of his co-sufferer and co-laborer for relief. During the weeks from January 20th to the end of February, both his little daughter and niece, under his own roof, were so strangely and sorely tormented that he and his whole household must have been wearied, agitated, and rendered miserable. When medical aid and kind nursing had proved abortive, and medical authority announced the working of an evil hand there, who can wonder, knowing the creed of the day and place, that Mr. Parris sought the law's aid for bringing relief to the little sufferers and to all beneath his roof? Samuel Parris and Thomas Putnam, the minister and the clerk of the parish, were both the first and the greatest sufferers affectionately at the oncoming of invasion by mysterious tormentors. And both have fair claims to be judged of tenderly in their connection with witchcraft prosecutions. The chief apparent action of the minister was as scribe or reporter for the courts, and this because he was more competent to that work than any other person obtainable there. Such action is surely not censurable. His position and abilities, however, were such that it was quite as much within his power to have stopped the whole proceedings as in that of any man then living, and they, no doubt, had his sanction and efficient support. And yet we find no ground from which inference either must or can fairly be drawn that the motives of the minister's actions pertaining to that special matter, both at its commencement and in its subsequent progress, were other than those common to the most enlightened and best members of the community. Still we have not learned to like the man. Selfishness, and disposition to rule harshly over his parish and individuals, if not resentfully and even maliciously, are made too manifest in the records for us to hold him in high esteem. As servants of God and Christ, which they professed and believed themselves to be, the prosecutors entered upon and long followed up war, bloody war, not against neighbors and men, but against the devil, the great enemy of God, Christ, and all good Christians. They were true, earnest, resolute, strong, fearless men, waging their fight in good conscience. The community at large, in which those men lived and held prominent position, was not below most, if below any other of equal numbers on the continent. Intellect there was keen, and morality high. Upham's History of Salem Village, admirable for its research, its thoroughness, its prevailing accuracy, and its extensive charms, clearly shows that the 500 people, more or less, residing there in 1692, could scarcely be surpassed by the residents of any other locality in intelligence, mental keenness, moral strength, personal courage, and firmness of purpose and resolve to live up to their convictions of truth, right, and duty. Salem witchcraft was born in the homes of intelligent, brave, honored men, who, in cooperation with their wives, children, and domestics, contributed to its growth, and elicited its vast and awful power to startle, frenzy, and desolate the region round about. The world at large has never been kept well instructed as to the circumstances amid which that great delusion made its entrance on the field of human vision, nor as to the high standing, intelligence, and character of its first escorts and sponsors. Its victims, too, as a whole, were very respectable. Some of them, it is true, were not high on the social scale, but the most of them were well up, and quite a number ranked high among the intelligent, virtuous, and saintly. The widespread and long prevalent notion that the dark doings there were little else than outgrowths from tricks played by a few artful and mischievous girls upon some low-lived and bedridden old women, has no foundation on the facts in the case. This most monstrous child of Christendom's creed had begetting in birth, in 1692, amid as reputable circumstances and people, and as religious opponents of Satan, as any marked revival of religion which has anywhere transpired since that memorable day when the leading men of Salem village, being challenged to defense of their homes, armed themselves with civil law, and bravely, long, and forcefully fought for God and his against the devil. Witchcraft's author. What personality or persons, and of what rank in the scale of being, was or were primal and chief in originating and enacting the famous Salem tragedy? If, as the generation then living believed, it was a specially great controller and commander of all invisible foes to God, Christ, and Christians everywhere, and who, having been effectually baffled in Europe, resolved to keep America from passing into the control of his enemies, God and Christ, and to thoroughly banish the hated intruders from these his more exclusive and prized domains. If it was that being, his strategy seemingly was to beard the lion in his den, to make bold and fierce attack on one of the strongest fortresses of Christians. Presuming that capture of such a post would lead to easy expulsion of all trespassers from the whole of his broad lands on this side the Atlantic. His apparent policy, judged of by the place and circumstances of attack, was to subdue the strongest first, and thus so intimidate as to frighten all others back to their former homes or the homes of their fathers. But such a devil was not there. Many beliefs prevalent 2 centuries ago are now obsolete. Such a devil as witchcraft was imputed to, and who was believed to put forth greater power over all Indian and heathen lands than God exercised there, receives cognition in few brains today. Nevertheless, faith in the presence, power, and malignity of such a being, present and at work among them, was the main force that enabled his contestants to unwittingly put an end to faith in the existence of any one special foe to all goodness, whose power and dominion over the earth and its inhabitants very nearly rivaled those of the Omnipotent One, and whose malice was a near counterpoise to complete supernal benevolence. Reason demands that the creature shall be inferior to its Creator, that devil shall be less than God, and she in most persons refers all things and all events, in the ultimate analysis of causes and agents, back to one great Oversoul, one God. If an all-wise and omnipotent One, being full of mercy too, proposed to subject an erroneous and enslaving human creed to a strain which should shatter it past restoration to strength, and thus to set its subjected holders free, highest wisdom may have seen that bright intellect, true courage, firm nerves, unfaltering devotion to sense of duty, and strong faith heavenward, were needful instrumentalities for best accomplishment of the design. The abode of people than whom none elsewhere were better prepared, more able, or more willing to fight the devil himself promptly, unfalteringly, and persistently, may have been a spot where supernal prescience saw that men, as blinded instruments, could best be made to effect their own and the world's emancipation from a time-hardened and disastrous public error. The mental and moral strength, and other good fighting qualities of its occupants generally, may have caused the village to be fixed upon as the most favorable battleground available for the projected struggle. Neither God nor the devil, however, was author in any sense pertinent to the present inquiry. Our ifs, and the sentences which follow them, cannot meet the demands nor the needs of modern readers. Faith, in direct personal action upon either individual human beings or communities and nations by any incomprehensibly vast and ubiquitous intelligent being either malignant or benevolent, is not as prevalent now as it was in many generations past. God, or a mighty devil either, as constant, immediate, and personal performer on humanity's stage of operations, is not extensively recognized by the deep thinkers of our age. Indeed, modern thought has come very low down in its search for witchcraft's author. Turning from God and the devil, the reputed workers of great marvels in ages long past, our interpreters of America's earlier wonders have fancied that they find the former existence of little girls whose powers to sway the human mind and agitate a land, so approximated those of omnipotence, and whose malignities so perceptibly equaled his of cloven hoof, that they of their own wills concocted and enacted scenes of simulated pains, distortions, losses of sight, hearing, and speech, and also mimicked the movements of birds and beasts, and performed such impositions and tricks innumerable as made their homes and neighborhood a horrid pandemonium. In doing which they manifested such prodigious power, skill, and perfect acting, that these little untaught and untrained ones outled in skill all the world's most expert tricksters, and, in malignity, the most devilish human monsters our world ever contained, in any age or land. Somewhere between the extremes of strength and weakness, of benevolence and malignity, we perhaps can find beings more likely to have directly produced the marvels in question than either God, devil, or little girls. Consciousness and experience indicate to most persons that an all-dominating power exists, and bounds and hedges in the spheres of freedom and ability which are occupied by finite beings. Something above and beyond all finites says to each of them, thus far, but no farther, canst thou go. Within spheres thus limited there abide many grades of intelligent and affectional beings, ranging in differences of powers and dispositions as widely as any mortal's thoughts can conceive. Vast, countless hosts of intelligences, though veiled from our outer vision, may be, and evidences are very strong that such ever are abiding dwellers above, below, around, and in the midst of earth's corporeal inhabitants. Within their unperceived abodes such ones may actuate the forces which evolve many less marked events, as well as all special providences, special judgments, miracles so called. And such marvels generally as were formerly imputed to either God or the devil as immediate author. We have no faith that either of the two had any closer or more special connection with witchcraft matters than with the ordinary doings of man. The undefinable source of all things which are contained in the vast creation, emitted all forth subject to laws, and surrounded and infiltrated by forces which enable the world's progressing inhabitants, visible and invisible, to purchase. Through study, toil, absorptions from enfolding auras, and other furnished helps, both knowledge and powers just as fast and great as their advancements and growing needs from time to time call for more light and for augmented powers. Finite beings naturally gravitate to where every instrumentality needful to their highest well-being can be obtained by the cooperative efforts and aspirations of finites, seen and unseen. For learning laws and manipulating forces which pervade their places of residence. Generations upon generations, whose mortal forms long centuries ago mouldered away, may still be active laborers in and about the men of today, and may be, and may always have been, the immediate manifestors of all supernal intelligence and marvelous force issuing from regions which the eye of flesh lacks power to scan. One of the old prophets of a prior generation made known to John the Revelator what he recorded. And agents of like nature, that is, departed human spirits, may have been the only revealers of supernal truths, facts, and visions to man. And the only workers of the signs or extra-marvelous manifestations of force and knowledge which have been deemed credentials from the omniscient and omnipotent. We believe in God and in the issuance of knowledge and force from him to man, but have not faith in his immediate personal putting forth of either, in accomplishment of such events as are often called special providences. Such events occur, they often come both uncalled for and in response to prayer, to yearnings, uttered or unexpressed. But the prayers and yearnings reach, stimulate, and help both ambient forces and ascended spirits to let in or to confer the needed protection or restoration. The air all around us is alive with hearers of prayer, and no humble and fervent aspiration for help to come forth from the mystic abodes of spiritual beings and occult forces ever fails to bring aid and elevation. The purer and humbler the aspiration, the nearer does it penetrate toward the great source of being, life, and bliss, and the more powerful and beneficent are those whose responses and emanations can reach and aid the petitioner. The same forces and laws which permit the sensible action of good spirits among men, just as freely and extensively permit the presence and action of malicious ones. God aids the good and restrains the wicked just as much and no more on the other side of the grave than on this. Freedom, whether to comply with or to contend against either natural or moral law, is as great in spirit spheres as in our midst on earth. Any spirit, either benevolent or malignant, is as free to use the forces and laws which permit spirit manifestations, as any navigator is, be he morally good or bad, to avail himself of winds, currents, tides, and the like. For passing over seas to a land not his own, and acting out his characteristic purposes there. Our position, fortified by the facts and reasonings in the preceding pages, is, that spirits, departed human beings, generated and outwrought Salem witchcraft. That is our answer to the question of its authorship. The motive. Thus far questions pertaining to the character of the main motives operating in the authors of acts called witchcraft, have purposely been avoided. The actors and their doings have been sought for, irrespective of morality. But the cui bono, the what good, must have been asked over and over again by the reader. Why did any intelligent being, whether mortal or spirit, thus woefully invade and disturb the homes of able, honored, worthy Christian men? And especially why perpetrate such agonizing cruelties upon bright, lovely, and promising children? The spirit world, as well as ours, holds inhabitants differing widely one from another in character, tastes, propensities, and occupations. It contains yearners to recommune with surviving kindred at the old material home, contains its rovers, its explorers, its scientists, its seekers after novelties, facts, and principles. After new places, scenes, and peoples to visit, after new routes and appliances for travel, and after new applications of known powers and forces. The motives for acting upon and through mortal forms may vary from worst to best, from best to worst. The moral character of motives can neither invalidate nor confirm what has been adduced. The motives, having been either good or bad, may be ascribed to spirits as well as mortals, and to mortals as well as spirits, for both good and bad beings dwell in mortal forms now, and both classes have left their outer forms behind, and passed into the abiding place of spirits, have become spirits, and that, too, without necessary alteration of their moral states. Motives in different cases and with different operators were doubtless quite varied. Correct presentation of their qualities in connection with the several cases adduced in the preceding pages is obviously beyond our power. Though conscious that we must probably be mistaken in some instances, we yet are willing to state some of the thoughts which facts and appearances have suggested. Perhaps no unseen intelligences aided or acted through either Margaret Jones or Ann Hibbins, and, if any did, their performances in and of themselves were never perceptibly harmful to the public. We apprehend, however, that if the whole truth were known, man would now see that kind physicians, who had bid farewell to earth, continued to practice the healing art through the brain and hands of Margaret Jones. The users of Ann Cole's vocal organs furnished no distinct indication that they were either specially benevolent or the reverse. We are constrained to regard them as having been low, ignorant, willing to excite consternation among men, and very willing to help the lewd greensmiths on, by the halter's use, to speedy entrance into conditions in which themselves could confer with these debased ones more familiarly than was possible while they remained encased in flesh. Such a view need not imply that they were malicious. Desire to hold closer connection with one's affinities is natural, and not necessarily bad. Communicators from the other side of death's portals generally decline to call any spirits bad. They speak of many as being low, ignorant, benighted, undeveloped, but seldom call any one bad. They seem to regard many much as we do green fruits. One omits to call the half-grown apple bad, however sour or crabbed, and says only that it is immature, unripe, and, implying that, though in its present condition not good to eat, time may come when it will be palatable and nutritious. Elizabeth Knapp's visitant, the one to whom she said, "What cheer, old man?" who presumably was the chief operator through and upon her form, and lingered about her for at least 3 years, we regard as a sort of recluse spirit, who kept mainly aloof from other disembodied ones, and found his chief enjoyment in retaining or resuming as close alliances as possible with the outer or material world, and from a selfish desire to secure permanent possession of this instrument, strove through torturings to reduce her to subjection. And this, perhaps, without desire to injure her, but mainly with a view to gratify his own selfishness. The other one, the pretty black boy, of a more lively disposition, found pleasure in playfully bantering the grave clergyman, and probably strove, in playful mood, to teach the honest and good man some lessons in charity and demonology. We see no reason why he may not be regarded as a genial good fellow, desiring to make some gloomy portion of mankind more cheerful and happy. At Newbury there possibly was nothing more than a playful and self-gratifying exercise of constitutional powers by a band of spirit gymnasts, not malicious, but playful and rude. Curious also, it may be, to see how far they might be able to frighten mortals and arouse consternating wonder, while they should be pleasurably exercising their own faculties. We view them as neither specially good or bad, but as heedless and rude in their frolic. Appearances are different when we look at the Goodwin family. There an embodied old wild Irish woman's spirit was the first to put forth psychologizing power over the children. She was moved by anger, or resentment, or both. Her guardian or kindred spirits no doubt helped her, and from motives like her own. Perhaps we may properly call both her and her aids bad. Yet we hear no call to apply that word emphatically. Little Martha had just charged the old woman's daughter with having stolen some of the clothes which the latter was employed to wash. And, if that charge was false, or even presumed by the old woman to be false, she, who was obviously fiery and ignorant, may not have been excessively diabolical in using any process of mental or emotional retaliation which was at her command. Perhaps ignorance and instinctive retaliation were quite as operative in her as malice. Martha's form, subsequently, when she was residing with Cotton Mather, was often used by one or more spirits who seem to have been bent upon showing the learned man that sport might exist and be enjoyable beyond the confines of mortal life. And that denizens there were disposed to make some at his expense. They soon showed him that linguists unseen could comprehend his meaning, whatever the language he might use for expression of his thought. And also thumped the sectarian by disdaining to read books which he approved, and by reading with ecstatic delight such as he condemned. Nor was this all. They exhibited in his presence feats of strength and agility, and many marvelous antics, which were suited to cause a thinker and scholar to hold on to his belief that others than the guileless miss took part in the performance of such marvels. While amusing themselves, they were exhibitors of instructive facts. Nothing bad in their purposes becomes apparent. The case of most special interest and chief importance pertains to Salem. Upham, Volume 2. p. 429, says, if there was anything supernatural in the witchcraft of 1692, if any other than human spirits were concerned at all, one thing is beyond a doubt, they were shockingly wicked spirits. Beyond a doubt. Perhaps not in some minds. But if any disembodied spirits whatsoever, even shockingly wicked ones, were mainly performers of the convulsing operations at Salem, the historian's theory of explanation is not only baseless, but is lamentably cruel and unjust toward the human instruments through whom the spirits acted. If specific doings prove their authors, if spirits, to have been shockingly wicked, the same having mortal authors, would prove the latter to have been just as shockingly wicked. We do not like to apply that defamatory phrase to all those girls and women who are set forth as the chief accusers. Were all those youthful females shockingly wicked? We hope not, and think not. God rules alike in the invisible and visible world, and often moves in mysterious ways for executing benevolent designs. The motive of Tituba's tall man with white hair, whom we regard as prime mover in the most momentous witchcraft scene the world has ever witnessed, is difficult to comprehend satisfactorily. The deliberateness indicated both by his visit to Tituba 5 days in advance of practical operation, and by his then appointing a special time and place for entering upon his intended processes, bespeaks a definite and abiding motive of some marked quality. Judging from the earlier and more perceptible effects of his doings, the world must almost necessarily regard him as a deliberate tormentor of innocent children, as a disturber of domestic, social, religious, and civil peace. As an immolator of the innocent and the virtuous, as hell's sovereign acting out his fiendish pleasure upon the inmates of a Christian fold. Infernal malignity, at the first glance, seems to have actuated this intruder at the parsonage. Worldwide experience, however, has learned that many things are not as they seem. We have been taught to recognize one being, and there may be many others in spheres unseen, in whose sight 1,000 years are as one day. Teachings of history and observation show that the overruling power is attended and guided by far, very far, reaching prescience, and also that many of man's greatest blessings are educed from temporal evils of vast magnitude. The malice of man nailed Jesus to the cross. What wears every appearance of wicked motive is often used as helpful, if not needed, instrumentality in procuring man's deliverance and redemption from debasement and oppression. When John Brown made his raid across the border line of freedom, not only the invaded South, but a large portion of the North regarded him as a ruthless and malicious invader of the rights of our fellow countrymen, and therefore worthy of a felon's doom. A cannon soon sent to Fort Sumter the comments of the South upon what Brown had done, and war, carnage, and horrors of varied forms and vast dimensions soon spread over the broad nation, from the St. John to the Southern Gulf, and from the Atlantic to the Pacific. John Brown was no felon, no malicious invader, but a philanthropic planner to strip the chains of slavery from 4 millions of his brother men. And his step, though a seeming evil then, led directly on to the emancipation of all for whose good he went forth in seeming malice. When plagues of various kinds were invoked and brought upon the Egyptians by and through the mediumistic Moses and Aaron, what Egyptian would have deemed that the motives of the unseen intelligence who counseled and controlled them could be benevolent? Plague, pestilences, and sore afflictions for a long time, and finally death of the firstborn, were imposed upon each Egyptian household. The motive to those inflictions is deemed to have been deliverance of the children of Israel from bondage. Egyptians being judges, it must have been a shockingly wicked spirit who acted upon them through Moses and Aaron. History, on most of its pages, shows that war, that ruthless trampler upon the innocent scarcely less than upon the offending, has ever been a very common, if not the chief, instrument by which oppressed people have gained deliverance, and through use of which the depressed have come up to higher standpoints. If our world has, through all its past ages, been wisely and beneficently managed by some intelligence higher than man, then far-reaching wisdom, supernal wisdom, has often seen that the good of the many, nay, the good of all, required the coming of suffering, sacrifice, and anguish upon the few. Has the great permitter of the many sufferings which war has engendered been shockingly wicked? The chains of old enslaving errors often become invisible and unfelt by those on whom they were early placed by a mother's kindly hand, and the like to which all associates wear as supposed helps, and never as suspected hindrances to expansion and health of mind and heart. Nothing short of a most strenuous conflict, nothing short of a struggle for life and all that makes life valuable and dear, is competent in some cases to awaken perception that such chains are and ever have been cramping their wearers, and holding them back from such expansion and freedom as their Maker fitted men to attain to and enjoy. We regard the Witchcraft creed as having been such a chain. Looking carefully at the methods by which the power that overrules all terrestrial affairs has almost invariably led man to break away from thraldom and oppression, can one reasonably entertain belief that any purely peaceful measures, any preachings, arguments, appeals to the reason of men, could have brought Christendom, at any time after the 12th or 13th century, to perceive that its witchcraft creed was enslaving its mind, and thwarting its proper expansion heavenward? We apprehend not. And also we surmise that in 1602 supernal intelligence saw that opportunity and power existed, which, if then availed of, could put mortals into a conflict which would reveal to them the inherent falsity and barbarity of the witchcraft creed, and thus let such light into their minds as, in time, would lead them to cast off the chains in which they were bound, attain to clearer and more accurate views of their relations to God and the spirit world, and rise to higher and freer manhood. If such were the case, we can readily conceive that supernal wisdom and benevolence might permit and foster the oncoming of an appalling and terrific struggle which should bring into vigorous action man's every latent energy, sweep away in its course many erroneous beliefs, hampering customs, and ruts of thought, and thoroughly overturn much which had long been deemed immovable truth. Such a course might be the most beneficent possible, even though it involved destruction of the comfort, peace, and lives of many innocent and most estimable inhabitants at the place and vicinity where the battle should be waged, and that, too, whether the war itself should be the ostensible offspring of revenge and malice, or a brave conflict for preservation of one's altars and fireside in peace. Some amusement, and little else perhaps, may be furnished by presentation of what a spiritualist's fancy, prior to careful study of facts narrated by Tituba, had become accustomed to deem not only possible, but probable. She was a slave dwelling among oppressors of her kindred and race, oppressors of the Negro, the Indian, and of those generally who were guilty of a skin not colored like their own, and of worshipping gods different from their own. What more natural than that departed ones, whom the whites had defrauded, injured, and oppressed while dwellers here, and whose surviving kindred were still being treated in like manner, should embrace an opportunity which the mediumistic qualities and the abode of Tituba furnished, for perpetrating retaliation whence woes had been received? True Christian morality may denounce such action as being shockingly wicked, but the more prevalent morality in the world, in the more resolute portions of it at least, and especially in the less enlightened, may be as ready to commend as to condemn it, and to applaud as to censure those whose fire and pluck induced and enabled them to pay over upon their oppressors wrong for wrong, even augmented with interest at the highest rates which their altered circumstances allowed. It having been discovered that Tituba's form was a portal for spirit return, Fancy saw the spirits of her ancestral race, and hosts of ascended aborigines of Massachusetts soil, eagerly coming back through her helping properties, disposed and eager to cast their impalpable arrows and tomahawks at any members of the wronging race who might be vulnerable by such weapons. Scouts swiftly and widely spread over the spirit hunting grounds knowledge of the glorious opportunity for retaliation and revenge which had come, and hosts of volunteers rushed thence with lightning speed to the alluring scene. Quick havoc ensued, and the great consternation, bewilderment, devastation, slaughter, disturbance of peace, and agonizings of terror and awe, which the invasion produced, gave keenest pleasure, satisfaction, and joy to the assailants. Possibly Indian spirits might then begin to cherish hopes of expelling all whites from the land of their fathers, and of reacquiring and leaving the whole a legacy to red men's heirs. But the whites, not less than the darker-skinned, were under the supervision of spirit guardians, friends, and helpers, who, though probably taken by surprise and at disadvantage, were by no means disposed to leave their wards, kindred, and loved ones to be long thus harassed and abused. Invisible hosts soon mustered, and warred against other invisible hosts over and around the village. And when the struggle had been waged far enough to sever witchcraft's chains, the laws of the highest permitted the guardians of the Christians to conquer a lasting peace whose balm would heal the wounds inflicted, and whose fruits would be emancipation from cramping errors, and consequent expansion and elevation of mental powers. As, perhaps, appropriate sequent to our fanciful views, we next present something which was not born in our own brain, and which may or may not be statement of ancient facts. We have devoted but little time to directly seeking information from spirits relating to the subject upon which we are writing, and yet have seldom entered into conversation with any good clairvoyant, at any time during the last year or two, without receiving description of one or more spirits then in attendance, and manifesting desire to have us recognize them. In most cases they have shown their names. In this manner Cotton Mather, more than any other one, signifies that interest in our present work draws him near to us. Mather's mother, also Martha Goodwin, Rebecca Nurse, and others, have presented their cards through persons ignorant that individuals bearing such names ever lived. But Mather has done more. On 2 or 3 occasions, using a medium's organs of speech, he has entered into conversation with us upon his connection with witchcraft. He is not now well pleased with his blindness when in his physical form, and urges us to be more severe in our criticisms upon his course than historic facts permit us to be. February 9, 1875, he was in control of a medium, and we inquired as to his present views of George Burroughs. At once and cordially he described Burroughs as one of the brightest of all spirits whom he had seen, and as illumining whatever sphere he enters. We asked Mather if he had ever learned who the spirit was that came to Tituba and started Salem witchcraft. He had not. Had he met Tituba? Yes. Can you not, we asked, find him through her? Probably, was his response. And we'll try, if you wish it. Well, then, we said, 2 weeks from this day and hour we will meet you at this place. This was arranged through an unconscious medium, who never receives into her consciousness any knowledge of what her lips utter while she is entranced, and she was on that occasion. We did not inform her, nor did any other mortal than ourself know, that we arranged for a subsequent meeting with Mather. We called upon the medium February 23, when forthwith, in her normal and conscious state, she said that she was then seeing at our side 2 spirits of very strange aspect, and of race or races unknown to her. One of them she described as a male, uncouth in aspect, having large piercing eyes, a very wild look, and as being clothed in a sort of blouse, beneath and below which were short pants tucked into the shoes, also his teeth were very large. The other was a female of unknown race, and of a race different from that to which the male belonged. Her complexion was dark, but she was neither Negro nor Indian, and exhibited the letter T. This medium may have known, and probably did, that we were engaged in writing upon witchcraft, but she is not conversant with its history, nor did she know the names of individuals concerned in it, nor the parts any had severally performed. Very shortly after having given the above description, the medium was entranced. Soon Cotton Mather, speaking through her, signified that he had brought with him both Tituba and her nocturnal visitant when she was slave of Mr. Paris. Also, he stated, that, since they were not accustomed to giving utterance through borrowed lips, he proposed to speak for and of them. The statement relating to the man was substantially as follows. His name was Zakahara. He was of Egyptian descent, but a Ninevite, or dweller in Nineveh. His time on earth was somewhat before that of Moses. Not long after his death, he, a spirit, observed that a spirit by the name of Jehoka, not Jehovah, was working strange marvels, and enacting cruelties among the race from which himself had sprung, through one Moses. And was thereby acting out a spirit's purposes toward man through a mortal's form. At once he, Zakahara, felt strong inclination and desire to exercise his own powers in the same mode. The desire clung to him tenaciously, and ever kept him alert, to find a mortal whom he could use with efficiency rivaling that which Jehoka manifested through Moses. No one of his many trials, however, was very successful until he put forth his skill and power upon and through Tituba. His ruling motive was desire to ascertain how far he, being a spirit, could get and keep control of a mortal form, and what amount and kinds of wonders he could perform with such an instrument. The motive was devoid of either malice or benevolence. It essentially was that of the scientist seeking new knowledge of nature's permissions. To keep Tituba in good humor with himself, he freely made promises to bestow upon her many fine things. And, to please her, he would say and do anything he thought might add to his power over her, and, through her, over other mortals. Such was the account. And, while it was coming upon our ears, it carried us back to familiar accounts of marvels of old, and we felt that the acts of Jehoka through Moses, and those of Zakahara through Tituba, bespoke motives so much alike in apparent barbarity, that, if either actor was blameworthy, it might be difficult to see why equal blame should not be meted out upon the other. Mather, speaking of and for Tituba, said, that, when the man first came to her and sought her service and aid, he was very bright and pleasant, but that, when she declined to comply with his wishes and demands, he became awfully dark and terrible. Briefly, Tituba herself managed the medium's vocal organs, furnished a simpering confirmation of Mather's statement, and said, with a shrug and shiver, he was awful. Awful. Subsequent conversation at the same séance elicited from spirits their belief, that, as soon as a door of access to men through Tituba was discovered, numerous Indian spirits were able and eager to rush through and lend a helping hand to the old Ninevite, and were devoid of any strong desire to help gently. Indeed, they were very willing to molest the whites on their own responsibility. Soon, when unimpassioned search for knowledge of what ability spirits possessed or might acquire to revisit and again act amid terrestrial scenes was too much attended by agents willing to enact, and actually enacting havoc too severe to be longer tolerated, wise and compassionate spirits brought power to bear which soon put a stop to what was producing most agonizing consequences. Spirits claimed that they did much in the way of changing the views of mortals, and preventing a renewal of prosecutions at the next term of court. Perceiving that enough cruelty had been enacted to make mortals ready to ask whether both humanity and God were not belied by the creed Christians were enforcing, they turned the minds of men to more rational and humane views. Sometime during the winter of 1874-5, Reverend G. Burroughs having poured out, through a medium's lips, a few sentences redolent with charity and heavenly grace, we asked him what he now deemed the motive which primarily induced some spirit to inaugurate the operations which brought himself and many others to untimely end. His response was, I suppose it was the natural and proper desire of some spirit to resume communion with its dear ones on earth. No spirit has ever indicated to us a suspicion even that the spirits whose acts evolved witchcraft were either malevolent, censurable, or in any sense shockingly wicked. Did supernal prescience select and post agents peculiarly fitted to perform the witchcraft tragedy? Perhaps so, and possibly Sir William Phipps was not governor by mere chance. Some statements by Caliph indicate that Sir William when young, perhaps while but a learner of ship carpentry in Maine, received a written communication which led him to go to Europe and obtain means whereby to seek for a wreck, the finding of which brought him fortune and title. He long and carefully preserved the prophetic paper, and, when flush in means, paid the writer of it more than £200. From the same or a similar source he forelearned his becoming a commander, governor of New England, and other events of his life. Information of that kind usually comes to such as are mediumistic enough to be susceptible of guidance, or at least of swayings, by the intelligence from whom the prophecy issues. Sir Phipps may have been himself mediumistic. The probable fact that the accusing girls named the governor's wife as one from whom they received annoyance bespeaks probability that she too had place in the class of impressibles. Therefore, one inclined to prosecute such speculations is here furnished with a basis on which to argue that the infinite prescience which permitted the advent of Salem witchcraft also embraced fit instruments in fit position for controlling its course, and also for putting a stop to it as soon as it should have outwrought enough of seeming evil to beget the good which infinite benevolence purposed to bestow upon mortals. Spirits take to themselves much credit for the part they performed in changing the opinions and course of the authorities and people here in the autumn of 1692, and the early months of the following year. The adjournment of the court, and no law permitting another session for months, gave opportunity for reflection. Also the actual and contemplated arrests of many of high standing and most estimable character were matters of sobering influence, so that reason resumed its sway, no more were tried for witchcraft, and all prisoners were set free. This may have occurred either with or without special action of spirits upon the public mind. We now regard the primal motive as nearly or quite devoid of moral quality. It probably was either a natural and proper desire to get access to dear ones left on earth, or some experimental or some scientific impulse to test the power which a spirit could exercise over those encased in mortal forms. When, before the days of ether, good Dr. Flagg had fixed his forceps firmly on our raging tooth, and given a long, strong pull till out of breath, our pains, our agony, our heavy blows upon his hand and arms, failed to make him let go. He was shockingly wicked at that moment, for he not only held on and kept us in torture, but pulled again without success, and even then he would not let go, but pulled yet once more, and the tooth came out. Spirits, getting access to mortals, may have judged that only through transient evils and sufferings could man get relief from severe chronic maladies, and that, when opportunity occurred, their kindest possible treatment of men was homeopathic, was the curing like with like, curing evil by inflicting evil. They may have been so shockingly wicked as to do that. Spirits may often, and generally explore and operate from motives not perceptibly different from such as actuate their human counterparts. The devoted vivisectionist seldom shrinks from entering upon, or gives up pursuit of, knowledge because the scalpel agonizes his living subject. So, too, a spirit in pursuit of knowledge, if, either casually or by intended experiment, finding himself controlling the will and organs of Tituba or some other impressible mortal, and thus opening up a new field for exploration, might be strongly inclined to see how far and efficiently he could wield forces of nature so as himself to sway the forms and affairs of embodied men. Each gain in power or skill for acting amid terrestrial beings, scenes, and objects, would naturally thrill him with pleasure, and incite him to follow up researches in the spirit of science. That spirit is prone to look upon sufferings which its own processes occasion, as but temporary incidents, and of little account in comparison with the beneficent results which its triumphs will procure. Extension of their own fields of knowledge and influence was perhaps among the chief motives which prompted spirits to perform the wonders that startled, frenzied, and agonized the subjects and observers of their operations in 1692. Another may have been self-gratification by revisiting well-known scenes, and yet another, beneficence to man by opening for his use a new source of knowledge and wisdom. Realms unseen are the abodes of sympathetic as well as of scientific beings. And as soon as a false creed had been forced to disclose its falsity, the former may have seen occasion to dissuade the latter from acting further upon benighted dwellers in mortal forms. Until time should bring man to calm reflection and retrospection, and to possession of such mental freedom as would embolden him to meet unawed, strange visitants from unseen realms, and extend to even such a friendly hand. The lapse of 150 years brought such mental freedom to us, purchased by the sufferings of our fathers, that, undeterred by fears of the halter, we now can invite to our earthly homes the loved and saintly ones who have passed on to realms above, hold blissful and uplifting communings with them, and learn their justification of the wonderful ways of God both to and through the children of men and in all nature. Whatever the ruling motive of the chief direct producer of Salem witchcraft may have been, the resistless power which moves all things, including malignant motives, onward toward the production of ultimate good, caused the fierce conflict we are considering to soon put an effectual stop to prosecutions for witchcraft throughout all Christian lands, and shattered to fragments a pernicious creed which had long enslaved the Christian mind. Costly as that struggle was in pains, sicknesses, tortures, anguish, physical exhaustions, domestic distresses, social alienations, church discords, languishments in prison, fears, frenzies, and even life, the price may not have been high for the widespread and abiding blessings of mental freedom which it obtained. Local and personal. Members of the First Parish in Danvers, and all residents on the soil of Salem Village. About 3 years since it was my privilege to speak briefly concerning the marvels of 1692, on the spot where they transpired. Courtesy then required brevity, and some vagueness of statement resulted. My remarks on that occasion are embraced among the addresses appended to Rev. Charles B. Rice's admirable History of the First Parish in Danvers, 1672–1872, a production of much more than ordinary merit. The present occasion is embraced to point out a misprint. On pages 186 and 187 of those bicentennial offerings, I am made to say that the little resolute band of devil fighters here in the wilderness became, though all unwillingly, yet became most efficient helpers in gaining liberty for the freer action of nobler things than any creed, and I never cherished a thought so derogatory to them as that they unwillingly became efficient helpers in gaining liberty. My spoken words were, that they unwittingly, that is, without knowing it, were being made instrumental in gaining mental freedom or deliverance from the chains of error. And I believe that a large part of the preceding pages tends to make the truth of my actual statement apparent, while it shows the falsity of the one imputed to me. The soil beneath you long has been and long will be either consecrated or damned to fame, damned, hereafter, if prevalent modern views of former actors there be correct. Consecrated, if the ostensible actors be viewed as chosen combatants and instruments on witchcraft's last and most widely renowned battlefield. Many of you know that I first drew breath and also received my earlier training and unfoldment on the soil of your town. My relations to witchcraft soil were not of my own choosing, and I feel no responsibility for them, feel no sense of gratulation, and none of shame, because of them. Still, no doubt, they increase my desire to set forth the merits of former dwellers at the village as having been as great and noble, and their faults as few and small, as authenticated facts fairly demand. And this not because of anything done or suffered by any one of my personal ancestors, no one of whom, so far as I have learned, was either accuser, accused, or witness in any witchcraft case. There, however, has been transmitted orally from sire to son what possibly indicates that one of them was exposed to arrest. Immediately after the prosecution ceased, Joseph Putnam, father of General Israel, was a firm and efficient opponent to Mr. Parris's retaining position as minister at the village. Tradition says that when rage for arrestings was high, he, being then only 22 years old, and his still younger wife, kept themselves and their family armed, their horses saddled and fed by the door, day and night for 6 months. This was preparation for either resistance or flight, as circumstances might render expedient in case an arrest should be attempted there. Opposition to prevalent beliefs, therefore, may not be a new feature in the family history. The heretic to the notions of many today, may have had an ancestor heretical to the witchcraft creed in 1692. But if heresy has come by inheritance, charity combines with it. For my heart is gladdened by each newly discovered indication that Joseph's elder half-brother, Thomas Putnam, the great and impartial prosecutor, and Anne, daughter of Thomas the great witch-finder, also that Mr. Paris and many other former villagers, never, any one of them, acted any part in relation to witchcraft that was not prompted by devotion to the relief and good of their families and neighbors, or forced upon them by unseen and irresistible agents. Your trusted teachers upon the subject, Upham, Fowler, Hanson, and Rice, all well informed in most directions, and well-intentioned, have severally favored the view that neither supramundane nor submundane agents were at all concerned in producing your witchcraft scenes. Their course throws tremendous and most fearful responsibilities upon both the fathers and daughters of a former age. And not responsibilities alone, but also accusations of deviltry upon the children, and of stupidity and barbarity upon the fathers, which make them all objects of aversion. And a stock from which any one may well blush to find that he has descended. No one of these teachers went back to the commencement of the strange doings, and scanned the testimony of Tituba, that personal participator in them, and the best possible witness. No one of them used, and probably none but Upham had at command, her simple but plain statements, that a spirit came to her and forced her to help him, and others pinched the two little girls in Mr. Paris's family, at the very time when their mysterious ailments were first manifested. The keen and exact Deodat Lawson states that the afflicted ones talked with the specters as with living persons. Mention of spirits as being seen attendant upon the startling works is of frequent occurrence in the primitive records. Therefore, facts well presented and authoritative have been left unadduced by your teachers. They, however, are a part, and a very important part, of things to be accounted for. Any theory of explanation that fails to embrace such is essentially faulty, misleading, and not worthy of adoption. Fair respect for historic facts, and especially for the reputation of those men and young women who were prominently concerned in its scenes, very properly and forcefully demands a widely different and less humiliating and aspersory solution of your witchcraft than such as has been proffered in the present century. My reading in preparation for this work failed to meet with either distinct mention of any meeting of a circle at Mr. Paris's house, or with any statement which had seeming reference to the existence of such a one, till I got down to Upham, who dwells much upon it and its influences, but omits mention of the source of his information. Since the publication of his lectures upon witchcraft, many writers have followed his lead. Knowledge of the locality and of the relative positions of the homes of those girls, and of their positions in those homes, is perhaps kept more steadily in view by a writer whose young days, and parts of his manhood, were passed there, than by others not so long familiar with the region. And perhaps he holds firmer conviction that gatherings, with the frequency and to the extent which are claimed, for the purpose of learning the arts of necromancy, magic, and spiritualism, under the roof of such a man as Mr. Paris, were very much nearer to an impossibility, than most others do who have of late had occasion to consider who enacted Salem witchcraft. If current assumptions, that the accusing girls, by study and practice, rendered themselves able to concoct and enact the vast and bloody tragedy imputed to them, and if their own minds and wills were properly authors there. If the prevalent explanation of witchcraft be much other than fanciful, then the magical skill and powers, and the brutal acts there manifested, loudly call for admission that wolfish fathers had begotten foxes, and were beguiled and spurred on by their own wily vulpines to commit such horrid havoc as must fix unfading and ineffaceable stain of infamy upon the spot where they prowled. The blackest smooch on the pages of your history was dropped from the pen which virtually made the village daughters incarnate devils, and their fathers gullible, stupid, and brutal mistakers of what their own girls performed for the marvelous doings of agents possessing more than mortal powers. God save the parish soil from the stain which modern fancy's course tends to impress upon it. Its men were never beguiled and aroused to perpetration of monstrous barbarities by the self-willed actings and words of their daughters. But genuine and mysterious afflictions of their children found the sires ready to fight manfully and unflaggingly for God and the deliverance of their families from mundane hells, and that, too, with such force and persistency as never before was equalled in witchcraft's long history, and with such success that no extension of that sad volume has since been possible. That was most emphatically a time that tried men's souls. And the souls then there proved to be brave enough to wage conflict against the mightiest and most formidable of possible enemies, and strong and persistent enough to force him to such struggle as strained his vitals, and paralyzed his power to molest grievously in any future age. The unique devil of witchcraft left that field of fight a Samson shorn of his locks. The source of his strength was there cut off, for the intensely indurated encasement of the delusion which centuries before had begotten him, and had ever since been feeding him abundantly, was then so thoroughly cracked, that its contents went the way of water spilled upon the ground, and he famished. Blush not for the fathers. They were heroes, true to their creed, their families, and their neighbors, true servants of their God, true foes to their devil. And their fight purchased the freedom which lets me now speak in their defense, devoid of any fears of the hangman's rope. And purchased, too, your no less valuable freedom to let me now speak without molestation, which would be impossible with a creed of the fathers now prevalent, and if you equaled them in devotion to faith. Because then my methods and processes for gaining knowledge would require you to hang either me or those through whom loved and wise ones speak back from beyond the grave, impart their hallowing lessons of experience in bright abodes, and their instructions in righteousness. Thank God yourselves that you hold no creed calling you to perpetrate such barbarity. Hutchinson's statement, that our witch prosecutors were more barbarous than Hottentots and nations scarcely knowing a God ever were known to be, involves a very significant comment upon the witchcraft creed. That creed made our fathers more barbarous than any tribe of men outside the Christian pale, and were that creed yours today, and were you true to it, you would be equally barbarous as they. Their struggle purchased for you and all Christendom exemption from their direful condition. Adopt the view, and we believe it correct, that the accusing girls were constitutionally endowed with fine sensibilities and special organisms and temperaments which rendered their bodies facile instruments through which unseen intelligences acted upon visible matter and human beings. The supposition that God made them capable of being good mediums, good instruments for use by other minds and wills than their own, and that their bodies, either apart from or against their own minds and wills, were concerned in the enactment of witchcraft, and then you may look upon each and all of them as having been as pure, innocent, harmless, sympathetic, and benevolent as any females in that or in this generation. And no descendant from them need fear the cropping out of specially bad and disreputable blood thence inherited, and each may regard his or her native spot as deserving to be consecrated rather than damned to fame, because they're true. Conscientious men fought manfully and legitimately for rescue of both their own homes and the community from direst of all conceivable foes, while living instruments of rare efficiency existed there, by use of which the Christian world was delivered from dwarfing and hampering slavery to a monk-made devil. What other battle, of any nature, ever fought on American soil, purchased choicer freedom, or effected mental emancipation more widely over Christendom, than did your fathers' conflict with their devil? May the year 1892 deem the spot worthy of a commemorative monument. Your last historian poetically says, that your witchcraft darkness is a cloud conspicuous chiefly by the widening radiance itself of the morning on whose brow it hung. Shining traits, qualities, and deeds of New Englanders in the 17th century, including the dwellers at the village, no doubt gave widening radiance to the morning of our nation's day. And the abiding brilliancy of that morning may be what makes your witchcraft darkness far more conspicuous than any in other lands. But it surely required far other than beguiled fathers and begulling daughters to emit the rays of a morning of such widening radiance as would make darkness more conspicuous there than elsewhere. That morning owed its brightness to far other traits than beguiled and beguiling ones. Clear perceptions of the demands of a creed, of duty to God, of duty to one's family. Prompt, vigorous action in obedience to God's direction and the King's law when the devil invaded one's home, fearless and untiring conflict with man's most powerful and malignant foe. These, and other powers, qualities, and acts kindred to these, emitted the radiance which made the blackness of witchcraft more conspicuous at Danvers than elsewhere in the broad world. No. Witchcraft did not rage with most marvelous fierceness, and enact its death struggle, on your soil because of the weakness, but because of the strength of your fathers, not because of their cowardice, but of their courage. Not because of their heartlessness and barbarity, but of tenderness toward their agonized families. Not because of lack of faith in God, but because of faith in Him so strong that it could put humaneness down, and keep it down till God's call to put a witch to death could be obeyed. Such properties gave to the morning of the village an inherent brightness which first extinguished witchcraft's dismal day, and now harbingers a brighter one, in which, no civil law molesting, spirits hold mutually helpful communings with mortals. That momentous and most valuable privilege was essentially won on your soil in 1692. Nation after nation, taught by results at the village, has repealed its obnoxious statutes, and broad Christendom is the freer and more elevated because of light widely radiating forth from your witchcraft darkness. Methods of Providence. Our planet, Earth, is yet crude. Its soil, products, emanations, and auras are coarse and harsh. Though ameliorated much since it first gave birth to man, it is not now fitted to nurture beings as refined as it will be centuries hence. It is being constantly softened, and is ever progressing toward the present ripened condition of older planets, whose embodied inhabitants easily and constantly commune with wise departed kindred, from whom they receive such instructions and aids as cause them to live in close harmony with the laws of animal health, and therefore nearly free from sickness and pains, and, when ripened for release, to pass painlessly out from their grosser integuments. From the days of remotest history, and our world over, spirits have often been transiently visible and palpable by some mortals. But the atmosphere in which humans live is measurably uncongenial and oppressive to most, and especially to purer and more advanced spirits. Still it becomes less so from century to century, is ever gaining such conditions as lift a little higher its incarnate inhabitants, and is less oppressive to those disrobed of flesh. Its modifications prophesy that time will be when mortals and spirits may hear more comfortably than now intercommune constantly and with mutual benefit. Terrific mental conflicts, moral tornadoes, agitations to the depths of society, are used as instruments in advancing Earth and its inhabitants to states which will permit spirits to be our constantly recognized attendants, and our helpful advisors and guides along the paths of spiritual progression. Progress is hastened through intense tribulations. Great changes and advances of either a material, mental, political, social, or spiritual world are, like births, generally outwrought through anguish and sufferings. Even the entrance of spirits into mortal forms is usually painful to both parties. First and earlier reincarnations are almost necessarily attended by psychological action which forces spirits severally to manifest, and, moderatedly, to undergo, again their special sufferings during their last hours of earth life. Mortals, too, shrink from, and are agitated by, and afraid of their nearest friends, if disrobed of flesh. Such fears are repulsive forces, making spirit approach arduous and often impossible. The boon of return, in most cases, is at the cost of suffering, but of suffering which pays well, suffering which purchases joy for both those who come and those who welcome them. Our earth and all who are born upon it receive or earn many of their greatest blessings through the sweats of convulsive throes or severe toil. The abolition of a widespread obnoxious creed was terrific in 1692. In civilized lands extensively, and especially in Protestant Christendom, possibility of the return of departed good souls from their invisible abodes has for centuries been doubted. Therefore a most copious source of valuable instruction and help has been unused. Resort to it has, or had, become horrific. It has been deemed by men the devil's pool exclusively. But not so by spirits. Wise and friendly ones, unseen, have long and often sought and labored for such recognition and welcome, by survivors on earth, as would render demonstration of spirit presence widely practicable. Spirits have sought this because they have been seeing that free and extensive intercommunings between dwellers in flesh and enfranchised ones might greatly facilitate the advance of both classes in beneficence and happiness. The immense aid which the earth-embodied living, and only they, can give to many unhappy ones whom they call dead, is not yet dreamed of by the public. Knowledge that many departed ones are obliged to get aid from earth ere they can make an efficient start up the ladder heavenward. Opens a wide and interesting field of labor to those who have carefully sought to learn the mutual dependencies of the seen and unseen worlds. The possible advent of instruction from unseen realms is now for the first time receiving practical demonstration among a people, who, as a whole, are able and disposed to scan carefully the nature and qualities of the intelligences who impart it. Prior to 1692, the Christian world had long been shrinking from conferences with unseen colloquists, deeming all such diabolical in purpose and influence. Ignorance was mother of its fears. The present age, more enlightened, more disposed to investigation, more prone to believe in the reign of law always and everywhere, asks the hidden teachers who they are, and whence and why and how they gain access to our homes. Their responses affirm, and each lapsing year of non-refutation confirms the allegation, that they are spirits now, but once were mortals robed in flesh. And that they come, some from this motive, some from that, some for fun, frolic, and even revenge and wrong. But more of them to give and to receive the pleasure and happiness which visits to their former homes and friends will generate. And especially to make known to their loved ones here the course of life which will best fit them for joy and happiness in the mansions and scenes of the world to which they all must come. The methods of Providence have ever been homogeneous. And now that they have brought peoples to the dawn of a day when human hospitality is entertaining angels, not always unawares, but often consciously and joyfully, the beneficence of the witchcraft scenes at Salem village, whereby Christendom's thraldom to a factitious devil was effectually broken up, becomes conspicuous. Lapsed time reveals probability that the barbarisms of that day were availed of as instruments for procuring the freedom which now permits instructive, helpful, and gladdening intercourse between millions of devout and truth-seeking mortals and bright, beneficent spirits. What though the agitation of Christendom brings its latent iniquities and impurities to the surface? What though the counterparts of publicans, sinners, and harlots float numerously into view? Ascent of dross and scum to the surface is usually the first product in processes of clarification. Inexperienced observers are very liable to regard the unsightly stuff as a sample of all that underlies it. Others, who better comprehend the cause and object of bringing impurities into view, observe such first results complacently, knowing that subsequent effects will be most beneficent, will present purified, and therefore more precious views of the divine methods of bringing men to righteousness, and will furnish more efficient helps to man's upward progression than have been generally applicable heretofore. Great reformatory truths have seldom been first offered to or received by the worldly wise and prudent. Not rulers and Pharisees, but common people, fishermen, humble women, publicans, sinners, and harlots were numerous among the first followers of Jesus, and these were the ones who heard him gladly. Like causes which made it thus of old, operate today, and the supplemental revelations and revealers of our time meet with like reception as did those centuries ago. It is well. Wide popularity and affectionate fondling might sap an infantism of its best health-giving and reformatory powers. Comprehensive wisdom lets it harden and strengthen through buffetings with the leaders of prevalent theological and scientific decisions, opinions, and fashions. The boundless intelligence, which ever acts for good, is patient and long forbearing. It waits for seeds of reforms to take deep root in the masses, and thence, in time, pushes onward the force which overturns dynasties, hierarchies, and all effete institutions, creeds, and customs which are no longer fruitful of food suited to cultured man's existing needs. Savage and barbarous nations, everywhere and always, attain to more or less faith in the presence and help of ancestral spirits, they seek instruction from the departed. Broad and perpetual belief in a particular fact is far from weak evidence of its positive existence. Uncultured minds admit witnessed facts to be positive occurrences, and affect no need to comprehend how they are produced before giving assent to their verity. But the cultured are prone to deny the manifestation of any events whose transpiration is not referable to the permission of some law whose operations are familiar. They cannot account for a fact, and therefore it does not exist, or, as Agassiz said, it is not in nature. The greatest of human scientists, however, falls far short of acquaintance with all the forces and permissions enfolded within boundless, unfathomable, incomprehensible nature. It is dogmatism, not science, which says that facts observed by the senses of man continuously from the birth of his race down to now, have had no positive existence. Law reigns, and we know no law which permits return from beyond the grave. Therefore departed spirits cannot revisit their survivors on earth. Such is often the position and argument of theology, science, and culture. But our question to them is, are you sure that you are acquainted with all the laws, forces, agents, and permissions in the broad storehouses of nature? Have you explored all realms in the universe, and qualified yourselves to maintain that you have definitely learned that no forces anywhere exist by which things anomalous to human science can be manifested to human senses? Practically you say, yes. And doing thus, you foster and fast extend belief in non-immortality. Are the results of your course to be lamented? Perhaps not. The oozing out and disappearance of an old belief, and a consequent state of non-belief, may be arranged for in the methods of Providence, because the latter state may be the best possible for the induction of belief founded on demonstration. Where one previously lived which rested upon dogmatic authority. The skepticism of our generation pertaining to a future life is an offspring of general and advanced education which asks for proofs as the only proper foundation for belief. That education has fitted the thinking masses to demand that teachers shall grapple with and either refute or adopt sensible facts widely witnessed. Millions upon millions of Christendom's inhabitants are having sensible demonstration, day by day and hour by hour, that the spirits of departed mortals make known their veritable presence among their survivors in mortal forms. They say to the world's leading minds, spirit return is a fact in nature, it is made manifest to our physical senses, we know it to be true. Therefore, ye sticklers for law and scientific methods, prove to us our mistake if we are dupes. During more than 25 years we have been putting forth that call, and you have thus long omitted to give any other response than dogmatic assertion that the appearances we witness are the productions of fraud, fancy, delusion, and the like. That is not satisfactory. Our claim is, that departed spirits of men are working marvels on the earth. That claim is good till it be shown that the marvelous events witnessed are the productions of other agents. Each lapsing year strengthens that claim. And if a check to such materialism as argues that man is devoid of any property which will consciously survive the death of his body, and if a positive demonstration of man's survival beyond the tomb be matters which the methods of Providence are employed to advance, then the unwonted numbers of returning spirits recently and now, and the frequency of their advent, together with the consequent daily and palpable demonstration of a life beyond the present, come to man most opportunely, come to him both when vast masses of mortals are prepared so meet and welcome them as friends and kindred, and also, and significantly, when their presence impairs the power of bright and leading minds to cause the thinkers of our age to anticipate annihilation of themselves, their kindred, and their race, and to suffer loss of the incentives and joys which attend anticipations of a heaven in advance. So welcome, efficient, and salutary an advent of invisible actors and teachers as we witness today, seemingly would have been impossible, had the witchcraft creed of our fathers retained abiding hold upon their descendants. The methods of Providence seem to have embraced both the abolition of that creed, and a sufficient lapse of time for the nurture and culture of a people up to such elevation that a large portion of it would be fitted and disposed to welcome back departed ones just when their proved presence would be the great fact at man's command which would effectually deter advancing and beneficent physical scientists from inferring and teaching that life's emigrants all take a plunge into the rayless abyss of nonentity. A continuous thread of the methods of Providence seems traceable through many of the darkest and most shocking scenes of human history. Many of man's greatest advances have been outwrought through anguish and tortures whose inflictors we reprobate. Is it too much to say that such a thread ropes in, as instruments of good, Pharaoh, Pontius Pilate, witchcraft, and many other notable personages and scenes, which have been made to further the deliverances of oppressed and suffering mortals? Permission of sins, sufferings, and wrongs comes from the infinitely benevolent. Fit instrumentality existed at Salem Village for demolishing that special creed of Christendom which closed and barred the gates that nature hinged for furnishing a way of egress back from beyond the grave. And wisest and kindest dwellers above were in mood then to let suffering and anguish enough come upon mortals there to awaken them out of their deep delusion, and sway them to set those special gates ajar. They broke the bars. But dust and rubbish long made a wide opening difficult and arduous. A century and a half was needed for such liberation of mortals from the crampings of delusion, and for such exercise of free thought in a land of free schools, as would educate a nation up to courage which could calmly ask any mysterious visitant whatsoever, who he was, whence he came, and what he wanted. In the fullness of time, this could be and was done. When culture and science were broadly producing conviction that there is no hereafter for man, one came forth from the land of the departed, knocked on cottage walls, gained the ear of common people, allured hosts of other spirits to follow him to human abodes. And the numerous band of returning ones is now the only host which can effectually stop the hope-crushing advance of materialism, and furnish the world palpable demonstration of an hereafter for the souls of men. In 1692, an unprecedented strain in its application effectually broke up Christendom's long-cherished and indurated delusion that devils unfleshed and devils incarnate are the only beings who can act and commune across the line dividing this from the life beyond. That rupture set Christians free to learn that duty called them to try the spirits. In time a generation came who met that duty. Spirits of God, good spirits, as well as others visit human abodes, and their presence itself is proof positive of man's survival beyond the grave. Their widely conceded advent seems divinely opportune, for it occurs when their presence tends forcefully to check, and promises to stop the prevalent strong tendency of science and culture to divine that man's doom is drear annihilation. The beneficent intensity of a special strain upon a specific delusion, 90 years ago, is due to the strength of faith, character, and action, and to the unwonted extent and excellency of mediumic instrumentality then existing at Salem Village, whose conspicuous action and use there made that spot lastingly memorable. And we deem it just to regard it as a point from which influences emanated whose fruits today are eminent blessings to the Christian world. The methods of Providence often educe choicest good from most direful evils. Appendix. Christendom's Witchcraft Devil. Christians, when New England witchcraft occurred, generally believed that it originated with, emanated from, and was controlled by one vast malignant personality, possessing frightful powers, aspects, and efficiency. A fair comprehension of what that being was then conceived to be is needful to anything like accurate knowledge of the origin, growth, sway, exit, and genuine character of occurrences which outwrought as dire strifes, horrors, bloodshed, and heart-wrenchings, as any courageous, intelligent, and conscientious people ever sided forward or suffered under. Christendom, in the day of our Puritan forefathers, believed in a devil peculiar to a few centuries, in one who was of more modern birth than the Bible or other ancient histories, who was very different from any being characterized in either Jewish or heathen records of antiquity, and has no parallel, we trust, in any creed today. Probably many malicious, as well as benevolent, unseen personages exist, who may often act upon men and their affairs. There may be powerful evil ones, in realms unseen, who there rule over hosts of like dispositions with themselves. Neither the existence of many devils, nor intermeddling by them with man's peace and welfare, is called in question. Authors of the Bible, when using the terms devil, Satan, and others of similar import, generally designated, as our own age extensively does, beings very unlike such a devil as was conceived of and dreaded by Christendom from 200 to 500 years ago. Prior to and during the days of Jesus and his apostles, such terms were often applied to whatever, in either the visible or the unseen world, tempted or forced men to wrongdoing, or hindered their progress in goodness. Jesus said to a disciple, "Get thee behind me, Satan." And this, simply because Peter was giving him advice more carnal than spiritual, and which was designed to dissuade Jesus from following the course which his conscience was prompting him to pursue. The mere giving of unwise advice made Peter a Satan. Turning to 2 Sam 24. 1. You may read that the Lord, being angry, moved David to number the people. Turning again to 1 Chron, 21. 1. You will find a description of the same transaction, in which it is said that Satan provoked David to number Israel. Therefore, in biblical language, even the Lord, when angry, was equivalent to Satan. Any accuser, in a court of justice or equity, might properly have been called a Satan, in the days of the prophets, for then that term was applicable to any adversary or opponent, of whatever grade or nature. Very much later than David's day the word devil frequently had a much softer meaning than it usually bears now. Jesus said, John 6:70, Have not I chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil? Having previously called Peter, Satan, Jesus here called Judas a devil. Thus highest Christian authority spoke of unwise and treacherous men as being Satans and devils, and thereby showed that those words anciently were sometimes applied, by the pure and wise, to other beings than one special great malignant spirit. The devil of modern witchcraft was unknown by Jesus and by all biblical authors. Whence, then, since not from the Bible, whence did Christians of the 17th and some earlier centuries obtain those peculiar conceptions of him, which made the devil almost counterbalance, in malignity and monstrosity, the benignity and beauty of the infinite God? Where did they find him? So far as we perceive and believe, his like was never recognized, either outside of Christendom, or prior to the Dark Ages. No being verily like him was ever dreaded as an enemy by any other people than Christians, and not by them till within the last 1,000 years. About all that we know is, that he had become huge and frightful at the time of the Reformation. And our belief is, that morbid fancy, in the cloisters and monasteries of Europe, through several centuries plied her lemnistic verbal skill, and thereby outlined and blackened piecemeal her most outre conceptions possible of the lineaments and expressions of a being as monstrous in shape, as powerful, wily, and malicious, as imagination could fabricate. And thus gave the Christian world a monk-made devil, a hideous personification of evil. Lapsing time eventually caused this cloister-born scarecrow to be looked upon as vitalized malignity incarnate, as an immortal, ubiquitous personality, as a living fiend of awful sway and force, who should be watched, feared, and fought by every God-serving man. We look upon him as a production of human fancy. But not so did our predecessors. They assigned to their devil of horrid form and huge dimensions a very different origin and nature. Where born, and what is nature, according to the belief of those who imported him to New England shores? Are important questions the appropriate answers to which must be comprehended before one can obtain just appreciation of the position in which their creed placed our forefathers, and the direction and force it gave to their action whenever seeming diabolism not only fearfully disturbed private firesides and social relations, but threatened tenure of lands, and continued existence of church and state throughout the colonies. Their author of witchcraft was conceived of, believed in, and set forth in language, as having been heaven-born, a glorious angel once, but apostate and banished from his native skies. As one mighty, malignant personality, almost ubiquitous, almost omniscient, second in power to Almighty God alone, and nearly his equal. As quoted by Upham, Volume 1, p. 390, Wierus, a learned German physician, described the devil as being one who possesses great courage, incredible cunning, superhuman wisdom, the most acute penetration, consummate prudence, an incomparable skill in veiling the most pernicious artifices under a specious disguise, and a malicious and infinite hatred toward the human race, implacable and incurable. He was, says Appleton's N. Psych, often represented on the stage, with black complexion, flaming eyes, sulphuric odor, horns, tail, hooked nails, and cloven hoof. Many of us now living have seen him pictured nearly thus in some old illustrated editions of the Bible. But the gifted Milton's comprehensive fancy and lofty diction, exempted, under poetic license, from adherence to fact or creed, or other enfeebling restraint, put forth, in masterly and acceptable manner, lineaments and features appropriate to an embodiment of his highest possible conceptions of combined majesty, might, and malignity. and thus allured his own and future ages to bow in awe before a devil who in grandeur far surpassed any which monkish powers had been able to fabricate and describe. He imputed to Satan eyes that sparkling blazed, his other parts, besides prone on the flood, extended long and large lay floating many a rude, unconquerable will, and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield. Resolved to wage by force or guile eternal war, irreconcilable to our grand foe, ever to do ill our sole delight, as being the contrary to his high will whom we resist. If then his providence out of our evil seek to bring forth good, our labor must be to prevent that end, and out of good still to find means of evil. Such was the great poet's archangel ruined. Nearly such was the prevalent perception of him by the general mind of Christendom. He was one mighty evil spirit, monarch of all fiends, and an untiring operator for harm to both the body and soul of man. Such conceptions were general alike in Europe and America. But still another view, quite as appalling as any of the foregoing, and appealing more directly to the temporal interests of men, operated in America, and made it specially needful for all property holders here to contest the devil's advances. Cotton Mather called the arch-mischief worker, a great landholder. And he was spoken of as though conceived to be temporal as well as spiritual ruler over all Indian tribes and their lands. And also as being a contester against God and Christ for empire over each and every part of the American continent where Christians encroached upon his sable majesty's domains. God and devil, each was a vast and powerful spirit, exercising sway and dominion widely, as the other would let him. And these two mighty spiritual rulers were often struggling in sharp conflict of doubtful issue for empire over particular portions of the earth. The devil, and such a devil too, occupied much space not only in the theology and philosophy of the learned, but also in the daily and worldly thoughts of the common colonists. Upham has forcefully and truthfully said, Volume 1, p. 393, that our fathers were under an impression that the devil, having failed to prevent progress of knowledge in Europe, had abandoned his efforts to obstruct it effectually there. Had withdrawn into the American wilderness, intending here to make a final stand, and had resolved to retain an undiminished empire over the whole continent and his pagan allies, the native inhabitants. Our fathers accounted for the extraordinary descent, and incursions of the evil one among them, in 1692, on the supposition that it was a desperate effort to prevent them from bringing civilization and Christianity within his favorite retreat. And their souls were fired with the glorious thought, that, by carrying on the war with vigor against him and his confederates, the witches, they would become chosen and honored instruments in the hands of God for breaking down and abolishing the last stronghold on the earth of the kingdom of darkness. This mighty devil, commander-in-chief of the countless hosts of all the devils, demons, Satans, Indians, heathen, sinners in, above, upon, or around earth, this mighty contester for dominion with God and Christ and all good Christians, was conceived to be author of all works called witchcrafts, producing them through human beings who had voluntarily made a covenant to serve him, and who resided in the midst of the people whom he molested. For we shall soon see that the philosophy of those times permitted him no other possible access to man than through persons who were in covenant with himself. Any covenanter with such a devil, that is, any wizard or witch, could be regarded by the public as nothing less formidable than a voracious wolf burrowing within the Christian sheepfold, who, if not at once unearthed and slain, would either actually devour, or frighten away from their pasturing grounds, all those with their descendants who had crossed the ocean to feed on the hills and valleys of America. Our fathers felt that the possession and value of their homes and lands, as well as the temporal peace and prosperity of the community, its religious privileges, and the salvation of human souls, were at stake in a witchcraft conflict. Their faith, their interests temporal and spiritual, their manhood, and all that was brave, strong, and good in them, called upon them to face boldly even such a devil as has been described above, and to fight him by any processes which had been tried and approved in Europe. The chief of which was, to seize his covenanted servants, his guns, and silence them promptly and permanently. Witches must die. Limitations of the devil's powers. Creed makers before the Reformation conceived, what is probably true, that natural barriers at all times have effectually debarred even the mightiest devil, as well as each and all of his disembodied imps, from coming directly into such close contact with a human body, or any other material object, as enabled them to produce effects perceptible by man's physical senses. Being themselves spirits, whether primarily earth-born or foreign, devils could effect direct access to, and could harm the minds and souls of men, and, unaided by mortals, could incite human beings to evil actions and self-debasement, while yet, so long as they were unaided by voluntary human alliance, they were absolutely unable to act upon matter, unable to subject human forms to fits, twitchings, tumblings, transformations, sicknesses, pains, and such as the bewitched of old experienced, and such as await many mediumistic persons today. Devils, formerly, and spirits now, to make the effects of their powers observable, or to make themselves felt by men's external senses, usually must act first and directly upon the equivalent to such nervous fluid or aura as enables man's mind to actuate his own body. Any disembodied spirit, of whatsoever grade or character, may be, and probably is, seldom able to command that intermediate aura, or that something, excepting when in or near an animal organism which possesses those properties or conditions, whatever they are, which render a person mediumistic. Constructors of the witchcraft creed probably had learned that nature always and everywhere makes matter intangible by spirit directly. And they thence inferred that the devil could never get into close contact with human bodies without the aid of some spirit, or of appendages to some spirit, who holds living alliance with matter, and consequently has in or around itself nervous fluid, or its equivalent, which is usable by mind not its own, is loanable, or at least liable to be abstracted. Transpiring observation now quite distinctly perceives that control of human organisms by disembodied spirits is usually attended by conditions fundamentally analogous to an antecedent covenant. The old creedmakers may have reasoned from facts of experience and observation much more generally and logically than the present age imagines. No special desire is felt, and we do not see that any special obligation rests upon us, to palliate the doings of those monastics who in dark ages both fabricated and shackled the devil of witchcraft. Still we do not begrudge them such justification as may flow out that passing facts. We have already stated the probability that nature makes physical man intangible by spirits directly. Because of protracted observations of their doings, we assume that spirits are able to read at a glance the properties of each form to which they give special attention, and are at no loss to determine what organisms are controllable by them when conditions are all favorable. One and an important condition is absence of resistance to control by the mind to which the susceptible organism pertains. The genuine owner generally can withhold his or her nervous fluids, or auras, or those properties, of whatever kind or name, which a spirit must use in the controlling process. And, consequently, a quasi-agreement, amounting at least to acquiescence on the part of the medium, is generally a necessary preliminary to any modern spirit manifestation, especially with mediums not much accustomed to be controlled. When and where belief prevailed that all disembodied spirits who ever actuated human forms were the devil or his imps, the inference that those whom he and his controlled had entered into an agreement with him, was natural and almost necessary. For an agreement or consensus between a controlling spirit and the will of the person controlled is very common now, and, no doubt, has been in all past ages. The assumption, however, which seems to have been prevalent formerly, that such consensus involved eternal reciprocal obligation between the devil and a human soul, or the sale of that soul to the evil one, could not be required or suggested by any facts perceivable by modern observation. No doubt each successive use of properties of a particular body by an intelligence from outside itself, generally enables the foreign spirit subsequently to manage that body with increasing ease to itself, and with more satisfaction probably to both parties. And the practice, if mutually pleasurable, renders prolonged cooperation probable, but cooperation for a time imposes no obligation or necessity that the parties shall remain forever conjoined. Common use of the same magnetism, nervous elements, or whatever they use in common, may tend to make a spirit and a mortal assimilate in their tastes, emotions, motives, and characters. This cooperation may evoke such sympathy between them, that each may often be drawn to the of other's aid, and conjointly they may manifest both physical and mental powers which neither could put forth alone. And it is possible that a liberated spirit may be so linked in sympathy with numerous other spirits, that the joint powers of many are at his service. So that through a single human form there may be manifested to the outer world the effects of the combined forces of legions of ascended spirits, either good or bad, in one accordant band. Obviously, spiritual beings, of whatever quality, are generally dependent, for any manifestation to the outer world, on one or more of a class of mortals possessing special properties or susceptibilities. Nature seems to impose such necessity. She does not let even man's own spirit act upon his stable body directly, but through something evanescent before microscope and scalpel. Covenant with the devil. Perhaps, and probably, the direst and most disastrous of all deluding misconceptions by our forefathers, the one which engendered, nurtured, and intensified the greatest evils of witchcraft, was that neither their huge devil, nor any subordinate fiendish spirit, could get access to external nature and human bodies through any other avenue than some man, woman, or child, who had already voluntarily made an explicit agreement with him or his to be his obedient and faithful servant, in consideration of helps and favors which the devil promised to bestow in requital. When such a covenant had been ratified by signature in the devil's book, written with the blood of the mortal party, then forthwith the devil and his hosts thereby became subject to his new servant's call, and the servant to the devil's summons. So that either could command the powers of both for cooperation in the execution of any malice or deviltry whatsoever, and upon any designated individual. The assumed fact that the devil could use the faculties and properties of no human being who had not expressly covenanted with him, conjoined with belief that he must have the voluntary help of some human being whenever he molested men, was the specially murderous ingredient of faith which impelled good and humane men on to copious shedding of innocent blood. The making of that covenant, and thereby opening an aperture for the devil's entrance through nature's barrier, and thus admitting a wolf into the Christian fold, who otherwise could not possibly have entered, constituted the essence of the crime of witchcraft. That covenanting act made the covenanting man or woman a wizard or a witch, and God had said, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." The devil's defense. The custom is humane and equitable which permits the accused to be heard in their own behalf. It is a common saying, that even the prisoner now at our bar is always entitled to his due, and we cheerfully grant him opportunity to defend himself. Under his alias, Satan, and using a cultured Englishman as his amanuensis, he has recently favored the world with his autobiography, in which he says, "I am a power. I am a power under God, and as such I perform a task which, however unlovely and however painful, is destined to put forward God's wise and benignant purposes for the good of man. I am an image of the evil that is in man, arising from his divinely given liberty of moral choice. That evil I discipline and correct, as well as represent. And so I am also a divine schoolmaster to bring the world to God. My origin is human, my sphere of action earthly, my final end dissolution. Evil must cease when good is universal. While, then, I cannot boast of a heavenly birth, I disown fiendish dispositions. Worse than the worst man I cannot be. I am indeed a sort of mongrel, born, bred, reared, and nurtured of human fancy, folly, and fraud. As such I possess a sort of quasi-omnipresence and a quasi-omniscience, for I exist wherever man exists, and, dwelling in human hearts, know all that men think, feel, and do. Hence I have power to tempt and mislead. And that power, when in my worst moods, I am pleased to exercise. I am a personification of the dark side of humanity and the universe. I exist in every land, and occupy a corner in every human heart. I am the child of human speculation. I came into existence on the first day that man asked himself, whence this world in which I live and of which I am a part. 1. The frankness, perspicuity, definiteness, and point, taken in connection with the calm, earnest tone, and gentle, candid spirit in which his then placid majesty dictated that account of himself to his reverend scribe, win our credence. and induce us to believe he utters only the simple truth when he describes himself as a personification of the dark side of humanity in the universe, as one who cannot boast of a heavenly birth, but was born, bred, and nurtured of human fancy, folly, and fraud, as possessing a sort of quasi-omnipresence and a quasi-omniscience, existing wherever man exists, dwelling in human hearts, knowing all that men think, feel, and do, having power to tempt and mislead, and, in his worst moods, is pleased to exercise that power. Such a Satan, or devil, no doubt exists. But, though we admit that he was a mighty impersonal power in the midst of witchcraft scenes, he was vastly different from the heaven-born archangel fallen, whom the good people of New England believed in, feared, and supposed themselves to be fighting against. A personification of the principle of evil, or of the dark side of humanity and the universe, is the only devil who is simultaneously present with the whole human race. But hosts of unseen personalities, earth-born, expanded, wily, malignant, and powerful, may act upon man, and bands of such may be subservient to some abler ones of their kind, who reign over them as princes of the dark powers of the air. Malignant departed mortals are the only disembodied personal devils who molest mankind. We believe in many devils, but not in Christendom's witchcraft chief one. The devil of our fathers, though but a fiction, was chief cause of witchcraft's woes, and therefore merits attention first, in any attempt to subject that matter to new analysis. Demonology and necromancy. Demonology, intercourse with demons, implies dealings with spiritual personalities. But these may be either good or bad, and may consist wholly, or only in part, of departed human beings, provided there be any other grade of spirits residing in, or able to enter, earth's spirit spheres. Probably there are not. In earlier ages, these demons were often deemed to be intermediate messengers and links facilitating intercourse between mortals on earth and most eminent gods above. That idea, somewhat qualified, is having revival now in the minds of those who are receiving from their departed friends instructions and influences which allure humans heavenward. In the olden faith, demon was used to designate a spirit who might be good, and demonology, then, far from being branded as diabolism or dealings with one great devil and his special devotees, was generally deemed not only innocent, but helpful. As much so as man's communings today with either his disembodied kindred and friends, or with benighted, forlorn, and anguished souls who seek needed encouragement and solace, which they can obtain from none other than an earthly source, are deemed helpful by those loving and philanthropic men and women who take active part in similar demonological interviews now. Bad as demonology seems at this day, when the word has come to suggest dealings with bad and demoralizing spirits alone, time was, when both it and necromancy, or intercourse with the dead, could be legitimately applied to such interviews as Jesus had with Moses and Elias on the Mount of Transfiguration. And therefore then might have imported communings that would spiritualize and elevate whoever experienced its operations. Strictly, there are no dead. Moses and Elias were living personages when seen by Jesus. Socrates, and many another ancient and wise teacher, drew much profound wisdom and inspiration from out the veiled recesses of demonology in necromancy. And the example of such wise and good men of old has practical imitation by the spiritually minded and philanthropic disciples of modern communicators living in supernal spheres. Biblical witch and witchcraft. Very great difference existed between the witchcraft of Bible times and that of Christendom 1500 years after John recorded the Revelation. The difference was almost as marked as that between the devils of those two periods. The word witch seems primarily to mean a knowing one, and perhaps has always hinted at knowledge or power acquired by some mysterious method. Witch has generally meant, not only a knowing one, but also any person who gets knowledge or help by processes which are mysterious. Witchcraft has been the utterance of knowledge, or the application of power, thus obtained. But neither all such utterance, nor all such application of force, was, in biblical times, called witchcraft. Far, very far different from that. Daniel, Ezekiel, and John the Revelator, all obtained knowledge mysteriously from the lips of departed men. Their promulgation of it, however, was not called witchcraft, but the word of God. Neither do the scriptures speak of the woman of Endor as a witch or practicer of witchcraft, though she had both a familiar spirit, and such clairvoyant powers that at her call Samuel rendered himself visible by her. And he either used her organs of speech, or impressed her to use them, in utterance of rebukes to Saul and prediction of his coming fate. This was not biblical witchcraft. Though, departing from biblical precedent, the modern world has fallen into the habit of calling the woman of Endor a witch, while that epithet is not applied to her in the Bible. His lawgiver said to Moses, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." But if that teacher furnished any very clear definition of either witch or witchcraft, it has not come down to us. Tempting to spiritual whoredom, so far as we can determine, constituted the crime of witchcraft among the Jews. The people of Israel were regarded as being wedded to the God of Abraham, therefore persons who by signs, by marvelous utterances and acts, tempted Jews to be false to their marriage relations with their God, were witches. The crime of witchcraft was not involved in simply putting forth knowledge, signs, and wonders by the help of familiar spirits, because prophets and apostles often did that when they put forth the word of God. Witchcraft was application of supernal knowledge and powers for the special purpose of seducing and tempting people to worship Moloch, or some other god of the heathen. See Leviticus XX 5:6. Bible witchcraft was use of mysterious acquisitions in teaching heresy. Protestant Christendom's witch and witchcraft. In the 17th century, much of the biblical import of witch and witchcraft, as well as of demon, had been either perverted or dropped, and belief was prevalent, especially outside of the Catholic Church, that none but evil spirits could come to men. And also that, the days of miracles, or special manifestation directly from the Almighty, had ceased. Then, too, a personal devil, heaven-born but apostate, and perhaps also myriads of other heaven-born but rebellious and banished angels, could, and only such base spirits could, get access to our external world. And they could effect entrance only through human beings who voluntarily consented and agreed to cooperate with them. It will be apparent on future pages, that any spirit then seen by clairvoyant eyes, whatever the sex, form, features, complexion, or aspect, was either the devil himself or some apparition formed and presented by him or his. And he was held responsible for its presentation. Our fathers attained to and held firm conviction that all channels for inspirations and mighty works, available since the days of Jesus and his apostles, were avenues for the influx of none but poisonous waters. This was a sad mistake. For, could they have perceived the groundlessness of their faith that supernal springs of truth, purity, and benevolence had been dammed against the emission of good waters earthward? Groundlessness of their belief that the possibility and feasibility of such works and inspirations as they called miracles had ever been restricted by anything but natural conditions. That perception would have rendered it apparent to themselves that they ought to make wizards of Abraham and Lot, of Moses and Samuel, of Daniel, Ezekiel, and John the Revelator, since each one of those communed with spirits. Our American predecessors in the 17th century believed it impossible that good spirits could come to man from bright abodes, doubted perhaps disbelieved, that departed men and women ever did return to earth, excepting by the immediate agency of the Almighty. And their writings and actions justify us in saying, that with them, witchcraft was injection of occult forces and teachings upon man, through consenting mortals, for malicious purposes solely, and by invisible intelligences. Spirit, soul, and mental powers. Perplexing diversity prevails among users of English language in their application of the terms spirit and soul. Some regard spirit as only a fine, invisible robe of the essential man, while others speak of soul as the robe and spirit as the man who wears it. Our own custom has been to regard soul as the man, and spirit as his undergarment during earth life, and his outer one, if he shall have more than one, when he shall put off his present outer. This view is not novel. The sometimes clairvoyant Paul stated that there is a natural or outer, and a spiritual or inner body, yes, body. Opened inner eyes today often see spirit forms pervading the outer forms of people around them. Their observations are in harmony with the Apostles' declaration. The essential nature of spirit is all unknown by us. Whether matter, spirit, and soul are but different combinations and conditions of like primal elements, we are utterly incompetent to determine. Practically we accept, what is probably a common notion, that matter and soul differ fundamentally. And, having done that, we are unable to identify spirit with either of them elementally. Therefore, without any definite conceptions as to its inherent alliances, we speak of it as possibly something between the other two, a tertium quid. Thought regards it as the substance of worlds unspeakably finer than material planets. Spirit, in mass, is not a living, conscious entity, any more than matter is. But is a finer than gossamer substance, capable, like matter, of becoming organized, and growing into a living enrobement of the soul, enrobement of that which constitutes the on-living man through all changes of vestiture. Such is our present conjecture. We apprehend that a world whose elemental substance is spirit both pervades and surrounds this material one, a world, we will say for the purpose of indicating our thought, composed of spirit matter. The invisibility and impalpability of such spirit substance are no conclusive refutation of its existence in and around us perpetually. Who sees electricity, magnetism, gravitation, attraction, cohesion, repulsion? Who sees either mind, or the force by which an aching toe reports to the brain and excites the sympathy of the whole organism? Many things are about us, and yet known only in their perceptible phenomena. Spirit substance may be all about us. The spirit world may be in, through, upon, and around the material one. Many manifestations hint at the existence of an all-permeating something, which, since the word is shorter than atmosphere, and not so liable perhaps to be suggestive of palpable matter, we will call aura. That contains and furnishes the elements out of which spirit bodies are formed, elements of the solid globe on which spirits live, and also is the medium of sight, sound, touch, and all sensation to man's spiritual or inner organism even now and here. A soul, encased within a body elaborated from and within that aura, may, when and where conditions favor, live, move freely, and be happy, whether near the fireside of its former earthly mansion, in earth's atmosphere above and around us, in the earth below our feet, under and in the waters of ocean, in the heavens over us, or wherever thought can go. It gives body to thought itself. Brick walls and granite mountains may be no hindrances to its movements, or its freedom and power to see, act, and enjoy. All such powers and privileges probably pertain to us as spirits, even while residents in these outer forms, provided only we can effect temporary disentanglements from the outer, as is often done by or for the highly mediumistic. And yet, so long as the two bodies of a human being retain their ordinary conjunction, something not yet well understood, generally either keeps the spirit senses from cognizable contact with what is conceived to be their native aura, and therefore holds them seemingly embryonic, or it keeps the exterior consciousness of most persons from perceptions of many things which inner senses may be latently experiencing. A broad survey of mediumistic phenomena raises the question, whether the inner powers of mediums, now in this life, and daily, see, hear, and learn any more of spiritual things than do the inner powers of others. Or whether the chief difference between the mediumistic and others is that the inner faculties of mediums are enabled, in consequence of some peculiarity in relative strength between the outer and inner or in the attachments between the two sets of organs, to report to the outer consciousness. And thus let their outer faculties perceive and report what the inner have cognized, while in the mass of mankind such process is not cognized. The young servant of Elisha, 2 Kings 6:17, was unable to see spirit hosts upon the hills about Dothan, which were visible to his master, but Elisha prayed, and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and, behold, the mountain was full of horses, and chariots of fire round about Elisha. The prophet did not ask that his young man should be endowed with any new organs of vision, but only for the opening of such as he already possessed. As soon as those visual organs in him, which could be reached and illumined by spirit aura, came into action of which he became conscious, the young man beheld spiritual beings. which beings, since the prophet had been seeing them all the time, were obviously as near and as visible before as after the prayer. Some spirit perhaps ejected spirit force upon the young man in such way as helped internal perceptions to impress themselves on his external consciousness. Spirits frequently throw some invisible aura with perceptible force upon the external eyes of modern mediums, when these sensitives are being brought into condition for conscious discernment of spirits. Whether the object be to awaken new vision, or simply to impress existing internal vision upon the outer consciousness, is yet an unanswered question. Perhaps each in different cases. Possibly an actual discernment of earth-emancipated intelligences by our inner organs, especially in our hours of sleep, occurs frequently with most human beings. That is, that inward man, or inner consciousness, of each mortal may be well acquainted now with many spirits and spirit scenes, so that, upon liberation from the flesh, emerging spirits may find themselves among acquaintances and at home. With some individuals, especially with prophetic and otherwise mediumistic ones, their knowledge, gained through sensations experienced by the inner faculties, is sometimes brought to and impresses itself upon the outer consciousness. And becomes too palpably operative that those individuals are deemed inspired, for they speak as never man, that is, as the outward man, spake. Either physical peculiarities, or peculiar relations between the outer or natural and the inner or spiritual bodies, more than the quantum of either mental or moral developments, seem to be the requisites for facile mediumship. That view is often set forth in statements made by spirits, and is rendered probable by observation of many facts. Mediumistic proclivities run much in families, about as much as musical ones do. And the capabilities for either mediumistic or musical performances are measurably constitutional and transmissible. Moses, Aaron, and their sister Miriam, all prophesied, or were mediums of communications from the realm of spirits. In our antecedent pages it appears that 4 children of John Goodwin, that 3 noble, adult, and married sisters, Nurse, Eastie, and Cloyes, living apart from each other, whose mother had been called a witch. That Sarah Good and her little daughter Dorcas, 5 years old, that Mrs. and Putnam and her daughter Anne, and that Martha Carrier and 4 of her children, were mediumistic. We can add to the list 7 sons of Seva, and 4 daughters of Philip, in apostolic times. Constitutional properties, combinations, or endowments, differing from such as are most common in the makeup of man, pertain to such persons as are or can be the most plastic mediums. In many people, the organized properties of their physical or mental structures, or of both these, and the relations of such properties to each other, and their mutual action, become, at times, so modified by severe sickness, proximate drownings, protracted fastings, sudden frights, intense griefs, by use of anesthetics, narcotics, and stimulants, and from many other causes, that those to whom the properties belong become temporarily mediumistic, though they be not observably or consciously such in their more normal states. The most common, and the more mildly acting agents or instrumentalities of such change, and those which produce the more abiding effects, are magnetic emanations and psychological influences from the positively mediumistic acting upon relatively negative systems. Such emanations may be seed originating new, or fertilizers quickening and expanding existing, inward growths. Emanuel Swedenborg was, prior to and independently of his marked spiritual illumination late in life, one of the most erudite and illustrious scientists of the last century, and, being a truthful, conscientious, devout man, trained to accuracy of observation and statement, he was admirably fitted for a reporter to the external world, of facts which came under his observation as an observer in spirit realms. And we take from his works the following short extracts, which have some bearing upon the topic just presented. Man loses nothing by death, but is still a man in all respects. Many are bewildered after death by finding themselves in a body, in garments, and in houses. Some had believed that men after death would be as ghosts, specters of which they had heard. The will and understanding are 2 organic forms, forms organized from the purest substances. It is no objection that their organization is not manifest to the eye, being interior to sight. How can love and wisdom act upon what is not a substantial existence? How else can thought inhere? Two sets of mental powers. Teachers unseen, speaking back to the world they have gone from, often say that, when here, they possessed two bodies, one of which is entombed below, while in the other they went forth and still abide. They say also that they possessed two mental systems and a double consciousness, one only of which survives. Quite recently, science, pressing forward in explorations, obtained perceptions of this latter fact. In his 8th lecture on the method of creation, given May 1, 1873, and reported in the New York Tribune, the eminent Agassiz spoke as follows. Are all mental faculties one? Is there only one kind of mental power throughout the whole animal kingdom, differing only in intensity and range of manifestation? In a series of admirable lectures, given recently in Boston by Dr. Brown Sequard, he laid before his audience a new philosophy of mental powers. Through physiological experiments, combined with a careful study and comparison of pathological cases, he has come to the conclusion that there are two sets, or a double set, of mental powers in the human organism. Or acting through the human organism, essentially different from each other. The one may be designated as our ordinary conscious intelligence. The other as a superior power which controls our better nature, solves, sometimes suddenly and unexpectedly, nay, even in sleep, our problems and perplexities, suggests the right thing at the right time. Acting through us without conscious action of our own, though susceptible of training and elevation. Or perhaps I should rather say, our own organism may be trained to be a more plastic instrument through which this power acts in us. I do not see why this view should not be accepted. It is in harmony with facts as far as we know them. The experiments through which my friend Dr. Brown Sequard has satisfied himself that the subtle mechanism of the human frame, about which we know so little in its connection with mental processes, is sometimes acted upon by a power outside of us as familiar with that organization as we are ignorant of it, are no less acute than they are curious and interesting. Many persons, including the author of these pages, more than 20 years ago found among phenomena called spiritual. Many which seemed imperatively to demand a broadening of the base of any mental philosophy which the world at large had presented to their notice, and apprehended that light was dawning amid the dark work of spirits, which might reveal to man more knowledge than he had ever obtained both of his own mysterious structure, and of his relations to and possible intercourse with his predecessors on earth. Many, perceiving this, have held on prosecuting such observations, and drawing such conclusions as their opportunities and powers permitted, undeterred by sneers and cold shoulders. And such now spontaneously hail with joy the arrival of the world's most advanced scientists at a new philosophy of mental powers. Such a philosophy, too, as manifestations well scrutinized have long been indicating would some day be based on the firm foundation of proved facts, and become a blessing to our race. Both spiritualism and science, by distinct roots, have reached a common point, and each testifies to the other's discovery of a new world in man. The subtle mechanism of the human frame, about which we know so little in its connection with mental processes, is sometimes acted upon by a power outside of us as familiar with that organism as we are ignorant of it. Acting through us without conscious action of our own, though susceptible of training or elevation. Such is the conclusion of Dr. Brown Sequard, which is endorsed by Agassiz. Backed by such authority, one may very courageously move forward in efforts to show that the very structure of man through all ages may have permitted certain human forms to have been controlled and used by intelligent powers outside of themselves. And without conscious action of their own, that is, without consciousness on the part of the individual minds to which those bodies naturally pertained. Such facts are guideboards designating pathways along which producers of prophetic, witchcraft, and spiritualistic phenomena can reach standing points for speech and action perceptible by men's external senses. These facts are keys, too, that will unlock many chambers of mystery, and we have used them in searches among the records of witchcraft. Those eminent savants do not state, and therefore we shall not maintain, that the outside power they refer to is spirits of former occupants of human bodies. But since that power is as familiar with the human organism as we are ignorant of it, the language surely implies reference to some intelligent power, for its familiarity with the organism is that of knowledge, the acquisition of which is contrasted with our ignorance. To whom can they refer, if not to spirits of some grade? The nature of things contains provision for temporary reincarnations of some departed spirits in the physical forms of some peculiarly organized and endowed human beings. This fact is important, and should be borne in mind during a perusal of the present work. Marvel and Spiritualism. We are reluctant to use the word miracle, because of its liability to be construed as designating not only an act performed directly by an Almighty One, but also that, in performing it, He acts contrary to the established constitution and course of things, which course we believe was never adopted. Therefore we shall use marvel to designate all works which have seemed to require more than human power, and have been understood to be more than natural. Such a marvel is a result from application of powerful occult forces which man neither comprehends nor can manage. Spiritualism is phenomena resulting from use of occult forces and processes by invisible, departed human spirits. Most genuine spiritual phenomena are marvels, but there may be, and may have been in witchcraft scenes, marvels which spirits did not produce. We left out from the definition of marvel, necessity for an intelligent operator. Impersonal influxes to many mediums may at times produce many things which are often ascribed to personal spirits. Our broad definition lets the word marvel cover all supernal revelations and inspirations from any god, spirit, or the impersonal spirit realms, all angel or spirit presence ever perceived by man, all mighty works, signs, and wonders ever wrought through prophets, apostles, magicians, sorcerers, and the like, all promptings, helps, and works by spirits called familiar, all necromancies, witchcrafts, and as a natural philosophy, our subject embraces all these. Its moral or religious aspects do not come under special consideration in the course of inquiry which is pursued by us. Spiritualism, as evolvements by finite unseen intelligences, using none other than natural forces, however occult, acting in subserviency to natural laws and nice conditions, has its rightful place with whatever has come forth from action of intramundane or supramundane forces and agents. Hidden intelligences in all ages and lands have had credit for performing in man's presence many mighty works, and for making revelations from the world unseen. Over the whole earth formerly, and over the larger part of it now, such intelligences have been and are deemed to be of all characters and grades, from very unfolded, pure, and benevolent beings, down to the ignorant, corrupt, and malignant. But our Puritan ancestry on this continent had inherited and brought hither with them a firm, unqualified belief that no other spirits but evil ones could, or at least that none but such would, operate among the Christian dwellers on New England soil. The mysterious workers and their doings were here excessively diabolized by the monstrous creed previously described, which prevailed all through Christendom during the 17th and some prior centuries, so that signs, wonders, and mighty works among our ancestors assumed forms, characters, and horrors which were never known among Jews, Christians, or heathen of old, and do not revive in our own times. There was then lacking here any conjecture at the same laws which in Job's time permitted Satan to mingle in company with the sons of God, might permit a son of God, a good spirit, to traverse the paths along which the sons of the devil, bad spirits, made approaches to the children of men. Moses, Elias, Samuel, and John's brother prophet were forgotten. We apprehend that facts of history teach beyond all successful refutation that spirits of some quality acted upon and through many persons in the American colonies during the latter half of the 17th century. Our fathers were not mistaken as to that fact, but their inhospitable and fierce slamming of doors in the faces of these visitants provoked terrible retaliations. One leading object of this work is to refute the position of intervening historians, that no disembodied spirits whatsoever had any hand in producing American witchcraft. Indian worship. The historian Hutchinson said, the Indians were supposed to be worshippers of the devil, and their powwows to be wizards. Such supposition by the mind of Christendom intensified fears and ruthless acts on American soil more than elsewhere, whenever suspicion of witchcraft was engendered. America was then understood to be peculiarly the domain of the evil one, and all its pagan inhabitants were regarded as his devoted adherents. Thence his followers here were deemed to be more numerous and formidable than elsewhere, and therefore his invasion was more to be dreaded on this than on the other side of the Atlantic. We must impute a considerable portion of witchcraft horrors to such narrow and cramping religious views and feelings among our fathers, as made all men everywhere seem to them not only outcasts from God, but also associates with Satan, who did not possess their special creed, and worship by their processes. They practically forgot that all men, of all nations and tribes, are the offspring of the unknown God, whom Paul declared to the Athenians. And also that his paternal beneficence extends to his children everywhere, and draws them toward him by methods suited to their circumstances, capacities, and needs. And consequently that all religious creeds and all modes and forms of worship may be helpful to those who possess and use them. History, literature, and public belief, pertaining to the religious practices of North American Indians, so far as we remember, have very uniformly ascribed to them something closely resembling communings and consultations with invisible intelligences. Such religious services are, and ever have been, rendered in all those primitive tribes the world over concerning whom we have attained to anything like accurate knowledge. See Primitive Culture, by Edward B. Tyler. Ethnology proves that belief in the presence of spirits, and, generally, belief in the access of ancestral spirits, exists among men everywhere in the nations lowest of all in culture, and survives in them as they rise in development. Dr. Bentley declared that the agency of invisible beings, if not a part of every religion, is not contrary to any one. Hutchinson, as quoted above, says, the Indians were supposed to be worshippers of the devil, and their powwows to be wizards. No question is raised that such a supposition pertaining to Indian worship was prevalent in the New England mind down to the close of the 17th century. Nor can we doubt that untruthfully the Puritans charged the aborigines with worshipping the one great devil of Puritan diabolism. Because of our conviction that the red men were in fact communing with their ancestral and numerous other friendly spirits. The white man's erroneous conception that his devil was the red man's god, had no small influence upon public action in witchcraft times. The idea that their devil had for backers all the aborigines of the continent, made him a more formidable foe than he otherwise would have been. And intensified the ruthlessness of the whites in their persecutions of those of their own complexion and households who were believed to have made a compact to serve the evil one. Perhaps a modern instance may exhibit with much clearness the real nature of Indian worship in former ages. We quote from the Washington Chronicle, early in the year 1873, what is there ascribed to General O. Howard, who is often called the Christian soldier. He, as commissioner from the American government, had, unarmed and with but 2 attendants, penetrated the fastnesses of the mountains, made his way to the home of the Apache Indians and to the presence of their fierce chief, Cochise. After council with the Apaches, they had, as General Howard writes, an Apache prayer meeting, one Indian after another would pray or speak. Cochise's talks were apparently the most authoritative. I could hear him name Stagolito, meaning red beard. I knew from this that our whole case was being considered in their way in the divine presence either of the God of the earth, or of his spirits, and surely these were solemn moments. Fortunately the spirits were on our side. These words indicate very clearly the nature of that devil whom modern Indian powwows worship. They make him on one occasion neither more nor less than the ascended chief Stagolito, associated with other spirits of the same nature. Can there be a doubt that Hutchinson misrepresented the fact, if he meant to call the Indian communings with spirits a worshipping of that monstrous being whom the word devil, uttered through clerical lips, or recorded by intelligent pens, in early colonial times, was intended and understood to describe? We think not. There was neither truth nor justice in the supposition that the red men were devil worshippers at the times when they were consulting departed spirits, nor in the presumption that their mediums, their powwows, were wizards. False epithets do not convert any sincere worship, performed even by the rudest of the rude, into a bad act. Those Indians of 2 centuries ago, as judged by us now, had truer conceptions and better knowledge of spirit intercourse with mortals, and of the fit methods of obtaining useful incentives and help from spirit realms. Then had their Christian neighbors, who misunderstood and blindly maligned the devotions offered to the Great Spirit by his children in the forests. The Indians, to the best of their ability, worshipped him who is the common father of all men of every hue and condition. They sought access to the Great Spirit, our God as well as theirs, through communings with their ancestral and other spirits. But the supposition that they worshipped such a being as the devil of Christendom, is obviously incorrect. Cotton Mather said that the Indians generally acknowledged and worshipped many gods. Therefore greatly esteemed and reveres their priests, powwows or wizards, who were esteemed as having immediate converse with the gods. Reverend Mr. Higginson, of Salem, said the Indians in that vicinity do worship 2 gods, a good and an evil. Mather and Higginson are better authority on this point than Hutchinson. Those denizens of the impressive forests were nature-taught spiritualists communing with their ancestral spirits, and through them were lured and helped on to worship the Great Spirit of nature, the omnipresent God.